Okay, so as you can tell, it's being delivered by myself rather than Dr. Bonython, and she says that far from having received a better offer, she's currently uploading all of her worldly goods and chattels into a shipping container. Apparently there are lots of sort of large Tongan blokes helping her at the moment. Loading her earthly goods into a shipping container as we speak in order to relocate from New South Wales to Queensland. She says all the content errors remain hers. She welcomes any feedback or suggestions that any of you may have, and she'll give her email on the last of the slides. So, channeling Dr. Bonython. So, thank you for the opportunity to present some of my research today. By way of providing some context, this presentation is based on some of my work currently in progress, which it's hoped will provide a better framework for understanding the tensions and lacunae in existing frameworks governing the transition of medical devices and pharmaceuticals from initial R&D through to market. It's accepted that the critical distinction between public health and medicine is one of numbers. Public health seeks to treat or maintain the health of the public. Public health represents possibly the high tide mark in benthamic utilitarianism, relying on epidemiological statistics and data. It utilises the maxim of the greatest benefit to the greatest number as the driver of economic rationalism in healthcare. If the data doesn't support it, and it doesn't, then that shouldn't happen. As an approach, it's stripped of the emotive influences afforded by consideration of the individual unless they arise in sufficient numbers of people to be quantified. Medicine, in contrast, is focused on treating the individual patient. Much is made in medical ethics and law of the autonomy of the patient, the importance of respecting the patient as a person rather than as the embodiment of symptoms, and of the highly personal relationship between the doctor and patient. It's a traditional ethical approach, including the notion of primum non nocere, or first do no harm. That's individualistic rather than collectivist. We're currently living through a period of disruption in both fields. While governments and policymakers are increasingly reliant on evidence-based medicine, typically driven by analyses of large or even population-scale data sets, high-tech medicine is increasingly investing in customised or even truly personalised approaches to healthcare. Both of these approaches raise significant ethical and legal questions for society. The former around privacy and data protection, Tessa's flagged some, and the latter around healthcare, equity and resourcing. Arguably, it's the utilitarian ethic of public health, facilitating as it does an economically rational approach to healthcare resourcing, that exerts greater influence in the current policy environment. Yet despite the disparity between the two approaches, it remains axiomatic that for every major clinical study which finds that drug X or medical device Y improved the lot of 89% of patients, there will be a further 11% who did not receive a benefit. Some members of that largely overlooked minority will potentially have suffered harm. And it's this small group, the subset within the 11%, that I'm currently interested in. This is where the Luddite shows that he can't get the... Arrow on the keyboard. Will the arrow on the keyboard work?
No, that's even. Yes. So just this one.
Sorry. Yes. Don't trust grizzly old bears in front of a keyboard. Okay, so regulation of access to novel treatments, medical devices and pharmaceuticals periodically captures public and political attention. So we've had the highly publicised failure of devices and treatments, ranging from failure to perform as expected through to unanticipated side effects causing disability and death. We have concerns about investments in and access to novel treatments for rare diseases, and the ability of market mechanisms designed to promote innovation in medicine to be deployed against the market. Those concerns are substantive. One, for example, relates to the self-proclaimed pharma bro, Martin Shkreli, who through his company, Turing Pharmaceuticals, got hold of the license for Daraprim and promptly increased its price from US $13.50 to a mere $750 per tablet. It's a large increase, certainly greater than the cost of inflation in the US. And that's a function of regulatory failure, not a reward for research. Headlines in mainstream media have translated into a number of reviews being undertaken by policymakers across multiple jurisdictions. In the UK, for example, Lord Such's Innovation Bill was debated extensively, if ultimately unsuccessfully, in the UK Parliament. The tragic case of Charlie Gard, case heard in the UK High Court, attracted comment and opinion from around the world, including, of course, expert opinion from the US President and from the Pope. Over the past 2 decades in Australia, there have been several Senate inquiries into failed medical devices, most recently the inquiry into pelvic mesh. And the SANSOM chaired a review of medicines and medical devices regulation report. The report was presented in 2015. There have been a number of high-profile class actions against manufacturers of both drugs and medical devices. Previous work by the Australian Law Reform Commission in 2004, while focusing on gene technology, identified a number of emerging challenges in developing and regulating gene technologies within the healthcare market. And although that review has in some instances been superseded by technology, remember it's 2004, almost a generation away now, many of the comments, many of the concerns identified by the ALRC regarding regulation of the technology remain pertinent. And more broadly, the Productivity Commission undertook a review of intellectual property arrangements in Australia in 2016, following on from a recommendation in the Harper-chaired review of competition policy. Now, concurrently, the federal government has committed and recommitted itself to a policy position of cutting red tape, reducing regulation across all sectors of the Australian economy. And unfortunately, the policy fails to meaningfully distinguish between good and bad regulation, or between markets which pose higher or lower degrees of risk to consumers. That failure, that policy failure, is emblematic of issues with law reform and the policy environment pertaining to medical devices and pharmaceuticals. It's a policy that coexists with a commitment by government to harmonise frameworks for drug and medical device approval through cross-jurisdictional recognition of approvals and streamlining administrative and review processes, another policy which prioritises commercial expedience over patient safety. Now, despite the abundance of policy and review work examining market mechanisms such as competition and intellectual property protection and medical devices and technologies, the analysis of each is fragmentary, leaving a significant gap in the body of knowledge vis-à-vis the overarching how intellectual property and competition in the healthcare market relate to consumer safety and access to new treatments and devices, and to the role of the regulator or regulators in managing this relationship. The relationship is a complex one. While a free medical innovation market might be depicted as this, intellectual property protection through particularly the patent system distorts competition by excluding competitors. It is, after all, a limited monopoly. And this is perhaps a higher stakes game of monopoly than any other. Health is special. Health concerns our lives, not our entertainment. Medical research, the bedrock of medical innovation, is based on scientific method. A critical part of that method is publication of results and observations so that others can independently and identically replicate the work, and indeed validate its findings. Patents stifle the ability of other independent researchers to replicate experiments using novel treatments and verify that the results claimed are in fact correct. It's no answer in, for example, the case of a pharmaceutical to suggest that an independent investigator can source the pharmaceutical from the patent-protected manufacturer and replicate the administration and observation component of the clinical trial in order to validate it. To be truly consistent with scientific method, that investigator needs to be able to replicate the trial in its entirety, including making its own pharmaceutical. But surely, regulators carry out clinical trials and validate the claims of manufacturers seeking access to market drugs and medical devices. Well, actually, no. Regulators are not resourced to conduct many experiments or indeed to conduct clinical trials. Generally, their decision to approve a drug or device for market is based on the data provided to them by the manufacturer. Data which, because of patent protection, is typically generated by that manufacturer. Further, harmonisation of pharmaceutical and medical device regulation increasingly means that regulators rely on desktop assessments of safety and other data performed in other countries, which may or may not have the expertise and infrastructure to ensure that those assessments are carried out to a universally high standard. And arguably we have some problems with patents coming out of China, for example. Manufacturers, meanwhile, complain about the amount of data required and the costs associated with both generating the data and achieving regulatory approval. Now, consequently, the medical innovation market is considerably more complex than might initially appear. A critical issue with the system in its current form is a pervasive uncertainty about who, or indeed what, is the market. References to the market in literature on the commercialisation of medical technologies abound, but disquietingly, there's little deep analysis regarding who that market comprises and the testing of regulatory rationales. Now, this issue takes on particular importance in the context of determining the roles of other stakeholders, including regulators and policymakers, and identifying where their duties and interests lie. In particular, there are critical deficiencies in the translation of the market at an abstract level to the realisation that the market is, in essence, a collectivisation of individual patient consumers and their referring healthcare providers. This is significant because the obligations toward and the expectations of manufacturers and regulators towards those referring healthcare providers, who are in effect de facto agents, are often quite different from those of consumer patients. Ensuring the market is sustainable is quite a different objective from ensuring that a particular device doesn't cause harm to a particular patient. And further confounding this conceptualisation is a failure to rationally account for the informational disadvantage and subsequent vulnerability of most patient-consumer participants within that market, making them increasingly reliant on the independence underpinned by fiduciary and ethical obligations, which may be in conflict with those quasi-agent healthcare practitioners owed to the consumer patients. This conceptual uncertainty has several consequences in practice. It leads to uncertainty on the part of regulators as to what their regulatory objective is. If the objective is to ensure the sustainability of the market, perceived in public health terms as the population, then manufacturers necessarily exercise greater influence by virtue of the protections afforded under intellectual property. IP is a protective barrier to market afforded to manufacturers. It gives them a monopoly over a particular drug or device, excluding competition. I think this is axiomatic. And in order to protect the market, therefore, regulators may pursue sustainability of supply of the device or good as their primary objective, which, due to market concentration, means de facto providing support to one supplier only. Now, this is an approach cited by many in support of greater interaction between manufacturers and regulators. It's one that's consistent with models such as cost recovery approval processes, and it's one that's consistent with perceptions of regulatory capture of the regulator by the manufacturers. So why is ensuring supply so important? The issue is largely one of public perception. In the event a drug or device is withdrawn from the market, manufacturers can, and indeed do, claim that their actions were taken because they were unable to comply with the demands of the regulator, rather than to create a panic and confess that the product is being withdrawn preemptively because of concerns about the safety. It's useful to blame the regulator. It's therefore in the reputational interests of the regulator to ensure that its compliance barriers are not so excessively onerous that manufacturers simply withdraw from the market. This can become problematic in the event that there's a problem by being reluctant to challenge or strain their relationship with the suppliers. The regulator may be conservative in communicating concerns about devices to consumers, or indeed about exercising its power to remove or suspend regulatory approval when concerns about a drug or device are raised. Further, in recent years, lobbyists and patient consumer groups have increased activism to influence the outcomes of regulatory bodies to add certain pharmaceuticals to the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, so public subsidisation of drugs in Australia, or the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, particularly in the cases where the condition is rare or the therapy is so new that the evidence base which would traditionally support inclusion is inadequate. This so-called right to try has resonated with politicians in many countries and underpins legislative moves such as Lord Saatchi's bill in the UK. It's been highlighted globally as an ethical challenge in relation to Charlie Gard, who I mentioned before. It's a toddler whose parents unsuccessfully sought to prolong life-sustaining measures to facilitate access of their child in the hope that experimental medical treatment would arrive. And facilitating access to new treatments for patients with rare conditions when the ability to recruit sufficient numbers of patients for traditional clinical trials was also considered by the Sansom Review. Problematically, however, all of these perspectives focus on the 89% of patients I identified earlier, the ones for whom the drugs or device offers benefit and those for whom it does no harm. None of these models adequately takes into account those patients who do suffer harm as a result of particular treatment. And consequently, currently, those patient consumers are not recognised under the legislation governing the regulator beyond a provision, and it's an exceptional provision, beyond a provision that excludes the regulator from liability for negligence. The TGA in Australia is uniquely immunised. So patients who suffer harm as a result of medical devices are essentially left as the victims of the tyranny of numbers, thwarted at every turn. First, they must identify that rather than being a purely imagined problem, enough other consumers, patients, have suffered the same or similar reversed events and have used the same device or drug. Then they must prove collectively that the drug or device caused the adverse events and resulting harm, or they must prove that the drug or device failed to perform in the way it was intended to, or that in some way it performed inconsistently with the obligations imposed on the manufacturer under Australian competition and consumer law. Now, all of these pathways feature significant obstacles, not least because they're all reliant on data. Typically data that's not available, or if it is available, hasn't been independently verified due to the informational barriers created by intellectual property protections and confidentiality. Essentially, successfully litigating against a manufacturer whose device or drug purportedly causes harm requires the manufacturer to release their own data showing that the device or drug can cause the purported harm, data that either may not exist or may not be easily relinquished. Now, in the event that the harmed consumer patient either can't find enough others similarly affected to lead a class action or can't meet the evidentiary burdens imposed, the cost of the harm will be borne by that consumer patient, their insurer if they're insured, and the public purse. Such an approach fails on both the Benthamic utilitarian approach as well as being inconsistent with the more individualised ethic of medicine. An inherent component of utilitarianism is that the true costs of doing the maximum good for the maximum number can be captured. Otherwise, the true value or benefit to the community is unknown and the justification for that action fails. We don't currently capture or measure the costs associated with device and pharmaceutical failure, including the cost to consumer patients whose existence we are well aware of as an inherent subset of our trial cohort, but whose identity will be unknown unless they participate in formal cost recovery processes against the manufacturer, for example, through a class action. And further, the current paucity of reparative pathways available to the subgroup of affected consumer patients is a clear example of Kant's humanity principle. Without adequate compensatory pathways for this group, for the group that we know exists, even if they're seldom acknowledged in policy, we are treating them as a means only, sacrificing their humanity at the expense of the ends of the communitarian model of public health in general and pharmaceutical and medical device regulation and access in particular. So, wrapping up, how can we redress the imbalance? Future work proposed by Dr. Bonython and myself in this area includes developing more comprehensive cost-benefit analyses of the impact of medical device and pharmaceutical failure on society, going beyond the current metric, which is restricted to the costs of operating the TGA, an entity that's essentially funded by the businesses that it regulates. And we also plan to examine the global regulatory framework for responding to medical device and pharmaceutical failures, in particular the viability of any non-litigation-based schemes and the role of independent evidence-gathering bodies such as the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review in influencing the approval by regulators as well as pricing regulators. Finally, I hope, this is Dr. Bonython of course, I hope to develop a proposal for a more equitable model of redress for consumer patients who are affected by defective pharmaceuticals and devices, defensible from both an economic and an ethical perspective.